We've got some very exclusive reporting here on the Daily Beans and over at the breakdown on my Substack at MillerSheWrote.com that the developer of the ICEBlock app, you'll remember we've had Joshua Aaron, hi Joshua, on the show before, developed an app so that you could enter when you see someone from ICE within a 5-mile radius. You can enter that location, and the app was available only on the Apple iPhone or in the Apple App Store. And we talked about how there was this, after an interview on CNN, there was this immediate rush by members of this administration to, first of all, go after Joshua Aaron and ICEBlock publicly with threats and things like that, but then to also contact Apple and coerce them to remove the ICEBlock app from the App Store. And when we last spoke, Joshua, I had asked her if you were going to file a lawsuit, and you said, we aren't taking anything off the table at this moment, and we'll keep in touch. And you've kept in touch, and later today, you will be filing a lawsuit against members of this administration that work for ICE, the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, and the White House. So everybody joining me today to talk about this lawsuit and why he's filing it is Joshua Aaron, the developer of the ICEBlock app, and one of the brilliant minds on his legal team, Deirdre von Dornum. Hi, Deirdre, Joshua, welcome to the Daily Beans.
Thanks so much for having us, Allison.
So most of the listeners of the Daily Beans are aware of the history of the ICEBlock app. They've seen my interviews with you, Joshua, but can you briefly sum up why you created this app in the first place and its intended purpose?
Yeah, so I created it because of the rhetoric that we heard from Trump, not only in the first administration, but certainly in the campaign leading up to the second time he was elected, which was just amped up hate speech 100 times worse than we had seen before. The night that he was elected, it was just my brain going a mile a minute on a million different topics that, how can we help? How can I do anything to right these wrongs that I'm seeing are going to be perpetrated on the American people? And the one that meant the most to me was this idea of this mass deportation, the biggest deportation in history. We're going to get all the problem people out, which, I think anybody with a logical mind knew meant any person of color in this country. That's really the impetus from creating ICEBlock. And of course, what it is, as we've talked about numerous times before, is it was a crowdsourced app that allowed people to report public sightings of immigrations and customs enforcement agents. And what would happen is other users within a 5-mile radius of that sighting would get a notification on their device, and then they could make the decision of how they wanted to proceed. Do they want to avoid that situation? Do they want to avoid conflict? Turn around, go home, protect themselves and their families? That was the whole idea behind creating it.
Yeah, and so now what we faced, and there's a pretty clear timeline of events, that I think show specifically that the government in this case and certain officials in the Trump administration actually used the power of the government to coerce Apple to remove your app from the App Store. And at that point, I believe it was in October, you had over 1 million people who had downloaded the app. I think it was 1.1 or 1.2 million people that were using the app. And I think it's important to note, and Deirdre, before we get into some of the problems that the government could face in this lawsuit here, I think it's important to go over what Joshua is suing for and what cases, like precedent, case law, is being cited in the lawsuit here.
Sure. So what we're looking for is a declaratory judgment by the district court, so that basically applying the rule of law to say that the actions that the government has taken violate the First Amendment by suppressing Joshua's speech and by keeping publicly available information from being circulated. Since all of the sightings reported on the ICEBlock app are of solely the location, no photograph, no video, no name, but the public location of public officials, to remove that violates the First Amendment. And we would like a court to say that, and to further say that such censorship cannot happen in the future, either for the ICEBlock app or other similar applications or speech, and also to enjoin the government from threatening to prosecute Joshua for the creation of this speech. Because it's not just that they coerced Apple. At each stage, the Attorney General and the other officials called the app illegal and threatened to prosecute or, investigate Joshua for his protected speech.
Right. And Joshua, those kinds of threats tend to chill us from participating and engaging in our protected speech. And it's not just you, although this is obviously, your lawsuit, but it's anyone else who might want to engage in protected speech when they see the government coming after them and trying to coerce private industry into basically stopping the distribution of free speech, because we can't do that. But the First Amendment is a protection from the government, not a right that the government has to control our speech, right? And so when you got notification from Apple about them removing your app from the App Store, did they tell you that we found that this violates some terms of service or something to that effect?
Yeah, so what happened is on October 2nd, I received a message from Apple that said, we received information from law enforcement that your app is targeting law enforcement officers. And we basically revisited our approval of this app and decided to remove it from the App Store. They cited what they termed objectionable content and the guideline 1.1.1. Now, what that guideline states is it's actually a pretty good guideline, to be honest with you. It says you cannot develop an app that targets a specific individual or group. But what it's meant for is don't develop an app that says, here's where all the Jews are, or here's where all the black people are. That could be a very dangerous situation. When we talk about public sightings of law enforcement, this is an issue that has been ruled on multiple times in the past. I mean, I know you and I have talked about, going back to when Waze was first created and the idea of reporting speed traps, and the exact same rhetoric was used with, they're going to perpetrate violence and our law enforcement officers are at risk. The reality is they didn't like the fact that they couldn't continue to operate with impunity. Well, it's the same thing times 1,000 with ICE, because this is a private paramilitary force in this country. I mean, that's essentially what they've developed. And so when we have masked agents who won't identify themselves, basically kidnapping people off the street, including U.S. citizens, by the way, this is not just our immigrant friends and neighbors. These are U.S. citizens as well. And there's no bounds to what they can do. Now we're saying, okay, well, here's where they are, so people can maybe choose if they wish to avoid that conflict or avoid that situation. And now they're saying that's illegal. And then we have Bondi in a Senate oversight hearing talking about how ICEBlock somehow has the agent's home addresses, and then had to walk that back 3 minutes later. And it's just one fear-mongering rhetoric after another to energize their base. Unfortunately, they have very much crossed a line, and we're going to aim to make sure that they can't continue to do so.
Yeah, agreed. Now, Deirdre, there are, let's talk about some of the legal
Sure.
requirements here, because, in order to survive a government motion to dismiss, right, you got to show irreparable harm. You got to show at least the likelihood that that what you're saying or alleging is true. And so one of the main points, I think, in this lawsuit after reviewing it is, you wonder, well, did the government actually coerce Apple into doing this? And a lot of times plaintiffs will have a hard time proving that. But in this case, Pam Bondi from the Department of Justice said with her mouth, using her words, I contacted Apple and they removed the app. So I think that, when we say something like on information and belief, sometimes it's a little bit ambiguous as to what that information and belief is, but it seems really straightforward here that the government, by its own admission, coerced and pressured Apple to remove this app from the App Store. So, can you talk a little bit about that, the standards that you need to meet to survive government motions to dismiss, and to bring a complaint in the first place, and how Joshua Aaron easily meets these thresholds?
Sure. Looping back and tying it back to your earlier question to me about what cases govern this, I mean, this falls squarely into a 2024 Supreme Court decision, finding that the then head of the Finance Commission or Industry Regulation Board for the New York State, Maria Vullo, had violated the First Amendment by pressuring insurance companies not to insure the NRA and not to insure, gun owners and gun associations. Similar to that, Maria Vullo had been very public about her criticism of the NRA and her concerns about gun companies and organizations like the NRA being insured by, insurance companies. And the Supreme Court said, you just can't do that. You can say, I think the NRA is scary. I think they're doing bad things. But as a government official, you cannot say, if you do this, you could be prosecuted, or if you don't do this, your regulations will be lighter, will go easier on you. So what we have to show is that there was coercive speech by the government. Not only did Attorney General Bondi already acknowledge that she pressured Apple, but before the app was taken down, she and the other defendants repeatedly, publicly on the news media said, it's illegal. We are going to prosecute them. It is not protected speech. So on a motion to dismiss, you just have to overcome one, you just have to state the facts and they're taken as true. So here, usually then you have to prove them. Fortunately, these statements are under oath before a congressional committee by the Attorney General of the United States.
Right. And I think if I recall correctly, and again, I'm not a lawyer, so correct me if I'm wrong, but when I was doing a little bit of research on the Jimmy Kimmel issue, what I found the Supreme Court said is that you cannot directly or indirectly coerce a private industry. And because in that particular case, it was the FCC chair, who was like, you'd better watch out. But in this case, we have Pam Bondi. We have, it's direct. It's not even indirect in this case. It is direct coercion and pressure. And Joshua, I want to ask you really quickly about some of the things that are going to make this case really hard for the government to defend. And first of all, let me just say this is against Pam Bondi in her capacity at Department of Justice. It's against Lyons in his capacity at ICE. It's against Tom Homan in his capacity as the whatever czar.
Border czar, I think is
border czar at the White House. Yeah. And then who is the fourth individual? Christine Noem, right?
Yeah,
as in her position, official capacity as the Secretary of Homeland Security. But there are a couple of issues that I think the government's going to have here. And one of the main ones is that early on in this process, starting, when you were just beginning to develop this app, and once it was developed, you had to submit it to the Apple App Developer Portal. And there was a very rigorous back and forth conversations, meetings and notes through the portal and on the phone, where they and their legal team go through your app and make sure it meets and does not violate the law or their terms of service. And you went through that process thoroughly with Apple, did you not?
Oh, I absolutely did. Yeah, it's called going through app review. When you submit an app, it goes to an app review team. They initially denied it, and I was fine with that because they wanted to make sure it was legal. It was doing everything that I said it was doing, and it wasn't, collecting user data. When I say it's 100% anonymous, it wasn't, subverting that somehow. And not only did it go through the regular app review process, but once it was denied, it went to Apple's legal, which is, I've never seen that before. And I had multiple WebEx calls with different members of Apple's legal team, and they were not short calls. I mean, we're talking, 20, 30 minutes a piece. And then once legal said, yes, we're good, there's no laws being broken here, everything's fine, it got sent to senior officials at App Review, and they then went ahead and vetted it from a technology standpoint. So there was no ambiguity in that. I mean, it was like 5 weeks of back and forth, which I had never, like I said, I've never seen that rigorous process before. But yeah, they signed off and they were fine with it. But it goes even beyond that, because once it's up, there's no users at first, and then it starts growing and growing and growing to the point that it becomes the #1 app on the App Store. To even surmise that Apple wasn't aware of this or it somehow slipped through the cracks is absurd.
Yeah, and Deirdre, one of the I think best tools you can have in your tool belt as a lawyer is some clearly similarly situated people who are not subject to the same problems that you are. And what we have here, and Joshua, you can speak to this too. I just want to sort of talk about the legal aspects of similarly situated things. We've got multiple apps on the Apple App Store that do this exact same thing. And Joshua, you created this app for simplicity. And like you said, Deirdre, there's nowhere you can put pictures or names or dox people, which is something else that this administration was accusing you of doing. So can you talk just briefly about the legal argument about these similarly situated apps that were not subject to this removal because of coercion from this government?
Sure. I mean, this is what makes it seem like viewpoint discrimination, right? Apple has its own app where people can post where law enforcement is. It's automatically downloaded in each of our phones and Apple devices. Ways you can warn of speed traps. And there's, Citizen, multiple other apps that remain up on the App Store. And importantly, there's multiple court decisions upholding the right to warn other people of the presence of law enforcement as protected speech under the First Amendment. Police officers used to try to give people tickets for flashing your headlights at another car to let them know there was a police officer, or having a police scanner. And the courts have said that is particularized speech. And as long as you are not inciting immediate violence, which of course publicly available information about the location of law enforcement does not do, that it is protected speech under the First Amendment. So the police have never liked this. But it doesn't matter whether you work for ICE or you work for Border Patrol or the state, you're allowed to warn other people. And, as we've seen, one function of an app like ICEBlock is to allow people to protest the activity of ICE lawfully, to be there to speak out, and to protect others from harm, including, as Joshua said, people who may be targeted based on what they look like, what language they speak, or where they work, as we've seen in these massive sweeps.
Yeah. And Joshua, you were telling me offline the fact that there are actually apps on the App Store that do what the government is accusing you of doing that are still up on the App Store. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, Deirdre was talking when she said, an Apple app. She was talking about Apple's own Maps app. So that's, CarPlay. I mean, we all who have an iPhone, I assume, are using CarPlay in their car, and you're getting speed trap notifications. So it's literally their own software that's doing exactly the same thing that ICEBlock was doing. But what's interesting is it was only available for the iPhone, and when Apple removed it, then Google immediately followed suit and said, we haven't even been contacted by the DOJ. We haven't been contacted by the government. We too are going to remove all law enforcement tracking apps. Well, it seems that they've removed all law enforcement tracking apps or anything to do with holding law enforcement accountable that goes against this administration's directives. It's not, if it complies with their beliefs, that's okay. But if it doesn't, it has to go. But the app, I think you're alluding to that we were talking about before we started recording here, is there's an app called Absher. I think that's how you pronounce it, ABSHER, that is specifically designed to basically put a leash on women. It's a Saudi-based app. I believe it's developed in Saudi Arabia, but the idea of it is for men to track the every movement of women. So when Apple comes out and says, we removed ICEBlock because the App Store is a safe place for our users, that's complete bullshit. Because when you're literally tracking the movement of a human being, that is what puts them in harm's way. That's what controls somebody's body or, causes them to be in danger. That's a bad app. That should be taken down under guideline 1.1.1 that specifically targets an individual or group. That is what 1.1.1 was designed for, not ICEBlock.
Yeah. And I mean, that's, to think that somehow that app is fine, but your app somehow violates their terms of service lends to the argument that this was coercion from the government to suppress your speech, disfavored speech that's disfavored by the government. I favor your speech. I want to ask Deirdre just two more legal questions about this lawsuit. Something we already talked about the government's argument that will be obviously shot down, that this is a tracking law enforcement and that's somehow doxing or somehow bad because we've got all these other apps similarly situated that do the same thing, that are actually integrated into our Apple devices that do the same thing and haven't been taken down. Another argument they might try to make is because, I was thinking of, well, what's the difference between our police and speed traps and ICE, right? And they might make this national security argument. What is your rebuttal to a government's argument that this harms national security and that as the executive, I am the president, I get to decide what is national security and what's not, and that allows me to somehow suppress free speech when it's a national security concern?
Right. Well, the courts have also said that even in the national security context, you can't just wave the flag and say, as the president or his administration is trying to do here, this is affecting national security. There has to be a factual basis for saying that. Here, there is no factual connection that's ever been shown between anything on ICEBlock that was posted and any act of violence or threat. And nor could there be, because again, it's publicly available information. So unless you're going to lock everyone in their homes and say they can't speak to each other and tell each other where ICE is, this is no different just because it's on an application platform. And it's really the highest level of protected speech because it's political speech, and it goes to protest, it goes to community safety, it goes to protecting each other. So the words national security are not sufficient, and there has been no showing whatsoever, and nor could there be because, again, it's publicly available information.
Right. The Second Amendment allows us to have guns to stop tyranny, and this is an app. So I think maybe that's why First Amendment is first. But the other question I had for you legally, and then I'll have one question for you, Joshua, is something that's called like the parade of horribles. Oftentimes we'll see in a lawsuit, if this is allowed to stand, if the court doesn't say and quash this and tamp it down, then this would be the result, right? And I'm thinking like, as I'm reading this lawsuit, I'm like, would it be illegal for me to call my mom and tell her ICE is in the area? Like, so talk about your parade of horribles. Talk about what the implications are if the court does not stop the government from doing this.
I mean, unfortunately, I think we're already seeing some of them, which is why this lawsuit is so important. I'm sure, as you know better than I do, the White House has been trying to force reporters to not report publicly available, non-classified information about our military. That's exactly similar and terrifying because, again, this is the sort of height of protected speech. But yes, if the First Amendment protects it, it doesn't matter what the platform is. Mm-hmm. So, could you be prosecuted for telling your mother? Could you be prosecuted for texting a friend? Could a newspaper be prosecuted for publishing information about ICE and their locations? All of those things are possible if this lawsuit were not to succeed. And obviously there need to be, legal attacks on these policies from many different angles. This is just one. But it truly is a slippery slope. And if we don't fight back, a lot could happen. It's one of our, at my firm, it was one of our concerns about the big law firms folding so quickly, some of them to Trump, because we're losing the actors who need to help to push back. and it's only, independent developers like Joshua, independent media, like you, Allison, and independent law firms like ours now need to bear the weight of that. And we want to do that, but it's important, truly important, that we do that.
Right. And Joshua, one last question for you. We know, like, I know what it says in the lawsuit about what you're asking for to enjoin the government from coercing Apple to stop carrying apps like this, and not just Apple, but any other platform that might be looked at in the future, and also to stop threatening you with, criminal prosecution, chilling your First Amendment speech. But what is your end goal? Aside from that, if you prevail in this lawsuit, is the goal to return the app to the Apple App Store and perhaps other platforms as well?
Look, I think we would hope that if we were able to get a favorable ruling here, that it would set a serious precedent, and would maybe give Apple cover to put the app back. Whether or not that's going to happen, I can't speak to that. I mean, who knows what they're going to do, or what behind the scenes conversations are going to happen that aren't going to come out publicly if, Pam can keep her mouth shut. So who knows? But, I think as to the intention of the lawsuit itself, I would kind of summarize it like this. And I know you love history like I do. So if we remember what Ben Franklin was asked, when he was asked what the kind of government the delegates had created, his response was a republic if you can keep it. And his point was that our democratic republic, it's not guaranteed. It requires constant vigilance and the active and informed participation of its citizenry. And I think a really important lesson that we need to take from that is that when we see the government doing something wrong, it is our duty as citizens to hold them accountable. And that is kind of the essence of what this lawsuit is all about.
Yeah. Chapter 2 of On Tyranny, defend institutions. Institutions do not defend themselves. Pick one and defend it. And I think that that's what you and your team here are doing. Deirdre, is there anything else you want to add about this lawsuit before we wrap up?
No, we appreciate your very thoughtful questions. We certainly hope that after we file it on Monday, the administration will acknowledge what's happened, although we don't expect that, but we certainly hope that they'll, be able to do
Girl,
that.
they're going to
and
go
that
back and
others
try to
join
indict
us.
Letitia James a third time. So I don't
Right,
think they
exactly.
have any kind of shame, or that they don't change their
Right.
tack
Well,
because
let me
of.
say,
You're
I
not
hope
seeing a
others
come to
will join
Jesus
us.
moment happening there, Allison?
Yeah, I
Wow.
mean, bless. That would be nice if they could learn from anything. But that is why these lawsuits are necessary, and that is why using and taking advantage of the judiciary and the rule of law and the protections of the First Amendment are so important. So, Deirdre, thanks for helping and filing this lawsuit. Thanks to the legal team. And Joshua, Aaron, do you have any final thoughts yourself?
Just one, because I always like to say it in any interview these days, is the app still works. If you have it on your device, do not delete it. Do not reformat your device or reinitialize it or anything that would cause you to have to re-download the app, because you will never be able to do so again. But if you have it, it is still just as private as it always was, just as anonymous as it always was, and it works just as well as it always did. So we encourage you to continue to use it to keep yourself and your community safe.
Well, thank you both so much. Everybody, you can look for this lawsuit. It's going to hit the docket a little bit later today on Monday, December 8th. Thank you for sharing the story with us. Thanks for letting me know about this lawsuit. I'm really glad that you're doing it, and I hope that you prevail, and we'll be keeping an eye on it. Deirdre von
Allison.
Dornum and Joshua Aaron, I appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much.